Greetings. I'm here to talk about Gnosticism, an early Christian movement that has aroused a lot of interest in recent years, even though it has long been condemned by the official churches. And Gnosticism, in its original form, flourished between 100 AD and 400 AD. 400 AD was the time when the Christian church took control of the Roman Empire, and all churches, other than the Catholic Church, were forbidden. All of the other Christian groups were outlawed. The pagan temples were closed. The pagan temples were destroyed. You see all those broken statues, those Greek gods, all those beautiful statues. Why are they broken? The Christians broke them. It wasn't an accident. And there's a reason for that. In any case, Gnosticism had more or less vanished by 400, although it surfaced in many currents that are still alive today. Gnosis is the way that's pronounced. It comes from the Greek gnosis, which basically means knowledge. In this case, it's a knowledge of an unusual kind. It is an existential knowledge. One Gnostic says it is about who we are, where we came from, and where we are going. It also is a knowledge of our situation in the universe, where we belong, and how to achieve higher states of both consciousness and reality. The Gnostics had their own system, which was not all that different, as we're going to see, from the early Christian system. And you had God up here, these benign spiritual forces called eons, and this figure, who is kind of a second-rate pseudo-deity called the demiurge. And below him were these archons, these figures that stood between us down here in material reality and the good God above. The demiurge comes from the Greek demiurgos, which means craftsman or creator. Most times in Greek, it's not used in a particularly bad sense, but in the Gnostic context, it is. This is an inferior, second-rate pseudo-deity who, as we've already seen, is between us and the good God above and blocks our way between us and him. These figures are called archons, and here's the Greek archon, archontes, and that means rulers. And these are the rulers of the heavenly realms, who are not necessarily our friends. Now, there's a great deal of disagreement about where Gnosticism came from. Some scholars have said it was the result of Persian and Zoroastrian influences on Christianity. Others said it was various strains of Jewish mysticism. Others have said it was Egypt or any number of other things. Unfortunately, none of these answers is satisfying, if only because there's very little evidence for these influences before the beginning of Gnosticism. Here may be the start of Gnosticism. The Apostle Paul, whose dates are approximately this, and who, as you know, was an extraordinarily important figure in the creation of Christianity. And much of what you know or think you know about the Apostle Paul is probably wrong, which is another lecture in itself. A lot of people say Paul regarded women as second-rate citizens. Wives, be subject to your husbands. Yeah, well, he didn't write that. Those come from letters that were written after his time and were put in his name afterward. All of those things that are supposedly anti-women are not original to Paul. They were stuffed into his mouth afterward. So that is one minor but important misconception that I'd like to dispel. That's Peter Paul Rubin's portrait of Paul, by the way. And here is the letter to the Ephesians, which may or may not have been written by Paul, but certainly is in alignment with his basic thought. It probably was written by his secretary, and he looked it over and said, yeah, these Ephesians want a letter from me. I really don't have time or energy to write it. Could you write something up? And this guy, whoever the secretary was, probably wrote it, and Paul looked it over and signed it, or something like that. So it is, although not necessarily authentically Pauline, in accordance with his thought. And here, I'll let you read the verse yourself. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, against spiritual wickedness in high places. These principalities and powers, contrary to what some may believe, were not the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was flesh and blood. Those were ordinary people. He's not talking about that. He's talking about figures very much like the Gnostic archons, because they're in between us and the good world above. They are the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places, that is, in heaven, not in Rome or Jerusalem or any place like that. This is a cosmic struggle. And salvation is seen in a cosmic sense. Well, he just used the word powers. Well, that's word in the original Greek is arose, just like archon. They come from the same root. And these archons are malevolent spiritual powers that interfere between God and the material plane. Where did this idea come from? Well, here is the demiurge. Here is an image of the demiurge. It's by William Blake. And this figure is called Urizen, which is his name for it. And Urizen is a funny name because it evokes a lot of things. Blake made the name up. It evokes, for example, your eyes. It also invokes the Greek orisdein, meaning to limit, from which we get our word horizon. And this demiurge, in fact, this is, as Blake says up here, the net of Urizen. This is our bondage to the material world. And the Gnostics saw it as bondage. They go back even to the Greek mysteries, which had a saying, soma sema. The body is a tomb. Oh, and then what happened? Well, what about Christ? Well, he broke their power by coming down here dying on the cross, so on, so on, triumphing over them. This is Colossians, another letter that was probably written by Paul's amanuensis or secretary, but again, reflecting his views. Now, to understand this, and here's another verse from Colossians, just a few lines down. Let no man beguile you of your reward in worshiping of angels. And these angels and these principalities and power have a great deal in common, if they're not the same things. And it goes back to Judaism, because it was true in Judaism then, and I still believe it's true in certain strains of the Jewish mystical tradition known as the Kabbalah, that the angels are ambiguous figures. Some are evil, some are good. But even the good ones are not always our friends. And there's a long tradition of mutual hostility and jealousy between humans and the angels. You're all familiar with the parable of the Prodigal Son. And everyone's familiar with the part the son goes off into a far country, comes back, is welcomed. But there's another elder son who never left. And he's mad because, hey, you're killing the fatted calf for this guy who ran away. I was with you all the time. I never left, and you never did this for me. Well, one esoteric interpretation of that parable is that the human race is the son who left. We went into the material world where you basically live like pigs, eat the slop that is known as food in this material world, and finally realize this is awful. I had it better back there, so you go back. And your brother, who never went away, doesn't really like that too much. The lore around this in Judaism is curious. There is one of the largest and most important Kabbalistic texts is called the Zohar, which means splendor. And unlike a lot of Hebrew texts, which are basic to the Jewish tradition, it is not written in Hebrew, but in Aramaic, a similar but not identical language. And it has been said that it was written in Aramaic, so the angels wouldn't understand it. The angels presumably know Hebrew, but if they figured out that all this knowledge was being shared with humans, they wouldn't like it. So this concept of angels who are not, again, necessarily evil, but not necessarily friendly to us, is an important part of this whole story. And here's one. Here's the most famous of them. Satan before the throne in heaven. Again, this is an image of Blake's. Well, here's Job's family, a little aware of what is about to befall them. Here are the angels, and here's Satan. And Satan is not really like a horned goat or anything like that. He's an angel just like any of the other angels. And if you read the prologue to the book of Job, it goes kind of like this. Satan shows up in heaven, and God says, hey, Satan, what you been up to? This and that, not much. Hey, how about that servant of mine, Job? He's a pretty great guy, isn't he? And Satan says, you poke him a little, see how good it'll be. And God says, all right, give it a try. And that is the setup to the book of Job in a rather colloquial retelling. So Satan is not God's enemy. He is a prosecuting angel. He is like a DA. Goethe, in his play Faust, reproduces this scene. In it, the devil says, I like to see the old man from time to time and have a chat with him. It's really quite charming of so great a lord to be so human with the devil. So this Satan is not this figure of cosmic opposition and evil that he later became. Now, the other thing about these angels is they're not perfect. They're subject to error. This is the 82nd Psalm. In the King James Version, I did tinker with it a little bit because the translation needed a little bit. There's God. In the midst of God, you will see gods sometimes in translations of the Old Testament. This word often means angels. Confusingly, it also sometimes means the single God, which is another completely different story. And he judges amongst the gods. How long will you judge unjustly and accept the persons of the wicked? Oh, you can read the rest of it. Now, this is also an extremely important piece in the detail because, by the way, it was believed by the original ancient Hebrews who wrote the New Testament that each nation had a ruling angel who was responsible for its governance. For the Israelites, this was Yahweh. He was their God. That's why thou shalt have no other gods before me. You worship the God of your own nation. Whether the other gods of other nations existed or not, well, I don't think that they necessarily doubted it. It's just that the Israelites were not supposed to do that. Yahweh was the great angel who ruled Israel. Later, he became associated with the high God, which is another lecture entirely. But the point is that here, these angels are imperfect, and there's this implication that they will fall. And this tradition, again, is found in the Kabbalah long after this. Pico della Mirandola in the 15th century said, speaking as a Kabbalistic axiom, no nation is defeated on earth unless its angel is defeated in heaven. All of these create kind of this background of echoes and resonances that we need to help understand Gnosticism and where it came from. Now, this is the world as it was known in the first century and even up to the time of Copernicus. Okay? Here is the earth. Here are the spheres of the elements. Here are the spheres of the planets. Here are the stars. And beyond is God. Each of these spheres surrounding the earth had a ruler. And guess what? Well, an archon, who are not necessarily friendly to us, as we've seen. The Gnostics gave these names to the archons. These are when the Gnosticism arose. Here are the planets. Remember, we're dealing with a Ptolemaic universe where the moon surrounds the earth, then Mercury, then Venus, and the sun, Mars, and so on. And here are their names. Yaldabaoth, Yao Sabaoth. Some of these will be rather familiar to anyone who knows the Hebrew Bible, like these two come straight out of the Hebrew Bible. Sabaoth actually means hosts, which I guess isn't a bad association for Mars, which is the planet of war. And this could be gone on. Some Yaldabaoth, who's the first one, that is the outermost one, Saturn. So it's kind of where it all starts. And some Gnostic texts identify Yaldabaoth with the demiurge. What did the Gnostics do with this? Well, we'll go. So the early Christians believed that these planetary rules were corrupt and inimical to humanity. So we've gotten to the point where these angels and archons are not just a bit unfriendly, but they're evil, wicked, corrupt. Spiritual wickedness in high places. Principalities and powers. As I mentioned earlier, the early Christians also believed that Christ had broken the power of these intermediary rulers. Again, as I quoted from Colossians before, having spoiled principalities and powers. Again, this is not the Roman Empire, because Jesus did not bring down the Roman Empire, as I think pretty much everyone could agree. Nor, by this theory, did he have the slightest interest in it, because his struggle was a cosmic one. Oh yes, that's right. The early Christians identified these defective gods with the pagan gods. That's why they refused to worship them. If they were just false, if they were just made-up gods that were, sure, I'll throw a little incense in the burner to Zeus. I mean, I don't want to be eaten alive by lions, but that would be worshiping demons rather than just worshiping, some god that somebody had made up. That's why they were so vehement against them. Oh, I remember I told you how they broke all the statues? Well, they believed that the demons inhabited these statues, and by defacing them, cutting off arms, cutting off heads, they were destroying the demonic powers in these statues. So the reason you go to the Louvre or whatever and see all of these beautiful but rather tragically shattered images is because it was done deliberately, almost always by the Christians. Did the barbarians do it? Yes, but guess what? By the time the barbarians conquered the Roman Empire, many of them were already Christians. So, who is the leader of these defective cosmic powers? Satan. Now, Satan has changed now. He is not just a prosecuting attorney whose job it is, and that is his cosmic function in Job and, again, in the Kabbalah much later on, which preserves many of the most ancient Hebrew teachings. He's an adversary. That's what that means. The other name for him is Diabolos, which means accuser. So he is the guy who is prosecuting you in the heavenly court. Again, he's not necessarily bad from a cosmic point of view, but nobody who's been arraigned for a crime and sitting in a docket regards the DA as his friend. And that is kind of the position Satan was in originally. By the time that Christianity took root in the 1st century AD, Satan had changed, at least in the eyes of the Christians and the circles out of which Christianity grew. He was the leader of the cosmic opposition, not just to humans, but to God. He was the ruler of the wickedness in high places. He was a figure of evil. And that is how he is presented in the New Testament. Although, what did Christ do after he was baptized? He went into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. If you read it, the plain language is, he went to the wilderness specifically to be tempted. So again, it was kind of a series of initiatic tests that he was supposed to pass, according to Matthew and Luke, where that account appears. Nevertheless, he is now just as bad as every lousy Hollywood horror movie portrays him, and portrayed often in a just as cartoonish a way. Now here is an echo in the New Testament of Christ's triumph over the demons. He sends out 70 disciples and to cure and heal. And they come back and say, even the devils are subject to us through thy name. And Jesus says, I beheld as lightning fall from heaven. So this is pointing to the idea that the coming of Christ shattered the powers of Satan and the power of these archons. One thing that scholars notice and emphasize very much in their studies of the New Testament is that its initial impulse was, to use a technical term, highly eschatological. Eschatology means having to do with the last things. In this case, it means the second coming and the end of the world. The Christians believed that Christ, through his death and resurrection, had shattered these powers, and everything was going to change. They expected this imminently. So there was intense apocalyptic expectation among the early Christians. Now, when I say early Christians, I want to clarify a point. There were many different Christianities in those days. There are all sorts of sects who we know about only as names, or one or two derogatory statements in the writings of the church fathers. They vanished as the Catholic Church came to power, like the Gnostics. These people believed all sorts of things. Well, they left very few records, and the only people who wrote about them were their enemies, so you can just imagine how accurate that was. So they may believe any number of other things. When I talk about the early Christians here, I'm specifically limiting myself to the Christians who wrote the New Testament, who all are coming from a basic kind of doctrine that they shared. There were others who believed all sorts of other things, and we know nothing of them, or as little of them as we possibly can, other than they existed. Now, the first book of the New Testament to have been written is not one of the Gospels, but Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, generally dated around 52 AD. The reasons for all of this are very intricate and scholarly, and of course I don't have time to go into them. But he's writing this church in Thessalonica, and he's writing to address various concerns they have. And one of them was they were starting to worry because, their loved ones had died and Christ hadn't come back yet. So does that mean they were out of luck? They were obviously genuinely very, very worried about this. And Paul said, no, they're not out of luck. In fact, they'll be resurrected first. Those which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. We are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord. That is to say, he is writing to an audience who expected Christ to return in their lifetimes, if not like tomorrow. And so he's reassuring them that you don't have to worry about the people who died. So that is merely intended to show you how intense this apocalyptic expectation was. And early Christianity cannot really be understood without it. Many people have argued that Christianity was originally a political or social movement. Well, there's actually no evidence for this. Like Jesus, according to these theories, was some kind of social activist. Well, if he was a social activist, where does this appear in the New Testament? He challenges the priests for their hypocrisy, but in terms of the actual governance, the fact that the Romans were in charge of Judea, didn't seem to be much of a problem with him. Well, you could say he said all these things, but they were taken out later. But that's a ridiculous argument, because by the same token, I could say, well, Jesus worshipped a monkey god, but they took all that out later. So you simply can't make that assumption. They were not opposed to flesh and blood powers, as we've seen in Ephesians. They were concerned about these rulers of spiritual wickedness in high places. who were much more powerful and therefore much more menacing. So there was this intense apocalyptic expectation that the Lord would come very, very, very soon. One account of this is the book of Revelation, which, of course, has become a Rorschach blot these days. The book of Revelation is kind of like anything you choose to project on it, which is often very amusing, but very rarely convincing. And it starts with Christ, by describing Christ's purging of these heavenly realms, the realms of the archons that surround the earth. There were 7 planets. There were 5 known planets, plus the sun and the moon. The ancients knew that the sun and the moon were kind of different from the other planets, but they were still in spheres around this. And they each was a kind of a source of bondage, just a band upon band upon band, all of which was keeping the human soul in bondage. And the first part of Revelation relentlessly, almost maniacally, repeats the number 7. There's 7 seals, 7 angels, 7 trumpets. Whenever you see 7 in those contexts, it almost has something to do with those 7 planetary rulers. By the way, just in case you've forgotten, this was not astrology to them. It was astronomy. This was the way they understood the world. And all of these purges going on in Revelation are the purges of these realms. Until this. The devil is cast out into the earth, right? Not into hell, right? And his angels were cast out with him. So these wicked powers were all thrown out of heaven and thrown onto earth. Incidentally, so Revelation is not a prediction of the future end of the world, but of what the author believed was taking place in his own time. And the general view is that Revelation was written in around AD 95, but this view is very likely wrong for a number of technical reasons. And it's more likely to be placed in the time of the Jewish War, which took place in 66 to 73. It was a war the Jews did not win. They revolted against Rome, and Rome beat them badly. But this was a time of even more fervent apocalyptic expectation. This was kind of a prelude to the fight to the end. Whether Christians revolted against Rome or not took part, probably some did, probably some didn't. The Gospel of Matthew, which alludes to this, says, just get out of town. Just get out. Just don't even go back for your coat. Just get out of town when you see this coming. So that probably reflects the, shall we say, the plurality of Christian opinion, which was very, very sensible advice. Satan, cast down to earth, took the form of the Roman Empire. The 7 heads of the beast, we're back with the 7 again, are 7 mountains on which the whore of Babylon sits. And the city of Rome was built on 7 hills. That's a famous trope. They're the 7 hills of Rome, the Capitoline, the Palatine, so on, so on, so on. So it is obviously a reference to them, to Rome. And obviously the author of Revelation, writing, I don't know, say 68 AD, was foreseeing that this Roman invasion would be vanquished by Christ coming down from heaven. And the beast would be tossed into the abyss and on and on. Well, this didn't happen. It just didn't happen. Again, the author believed this was imminent, and it was happening in his own time. Revelation, incidentally, talks about 7 kings of this whoredom and abomination, and that could easily lead us to think of 7 emperors, to think that it was probably written in the time of the 7th emperor, which would be one Galba. And Galba didn't do so great as an emperor. In fact, he only lasted 3 months. Neither did his successors. It was called the Year of the 4 Emperors. What was that, 68, 69. So if you assume that John, the author of Revelation, is seeing that, like, well, the 7th king, he's probably thinking in terms of that. And of course, he's going to fit it into his 7-fold schema. So this was kind of when it was all going to happen. To state the obvious, what happened? In AD 70, the Romans besieged Jerusalem, sacked it, and destroyed the temple, which was, in the Jewish world, one of the great calamities that is still mourned to this day. There's only one piece of it left, which is actually a retaining wall, not part of the temple of itself. It's in Jerusalem, and it's called the Wailing Wall. You can go online and see picture after picture of it. It's regarded as extremely holy because it's the last fragment of the temple, which was never rebuilt. And the Romans came and they depopulated a lot of Judea. They killed a number of people, sold a number more into slavery. But there was no apocalyptic ending. Cats, as the saying goes, continued to have kittens. And this led to a kind of crisis of faith, which started to occur around the 1st century, when it was pretty obvious that everybody who'd been alive in Jesus' time, the whole first generation of Christians, was gone. And still it hadn't come. And one reply to it is written in this letter, the last of the New Testament texts to have been written, sometimes dated as late as 130, attributed to Peter, but it was not by Peter. How do we know? Well, here's one reason. There'll come scoffers. Where is this promise of his coming? Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Well, guess what? Who are the fathers? The apostles, one of whom was Peter. So if only by that, we know that Peter didn't write it. But the author of it was trying to say, hold on here, don't lose faith. Now, at this point, I'm suggesting, this intense disappointment of faith was what led to the Gnostic movement as it came to be known. The mainstream church, the proto-Catholic church, it was a proto-Catholic church, it was not a Catholic church. Yeah, there were no popes in those days. No matter, you'll see this, Pope the whatever in the 2nd century. They were not popes. They were just bishops of Rome, and they had no more authority than any other bishops. The popes came later. But this Catholic church decided, well, we better just take stock here. The scriptures teach that the last days will come. And of course, we can't deny that or contradict it. But we're going to have to face the fact that we don't know when this is going to be. So we have to kind of accommodate ourselves to life in the world as we know it. We simply cannot just expect Jesus to show up and smash everything and make everything really nice again. He will, but we don't know when that be, and we have to live in the meantime. That was the Catholic response and the Orthodox response. All practically all Christian sects today, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, whatever, no matter how fringe, are in one way or another descendants or deviations of this proto-Catholic church. The Gnostics took a different thing. They believed that these archons had been smashed in a way, but they were still in control of the physical world, and they did not think they had been smashed by the returning Jesus. So they were still, the archons are still alive and functioning in these intermediary realms. And the way out of these realms was through gnosis, which was spiritual illumination. It was, as I said, a knowledge of who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. But sometimes it actually involved rituals and invocations to call the names of these archons and, thereby disempowering them, at least as far as the initiate is concerned. And there are rites and ceremonies for this. None that are really so clear that you could take it on a step-by-step basis. But this was part of Gnostic practice, to disempower the archons, at least in regard to oneself or a small number of the community, who are called pneumatikoi, meaning spiritual people. Sometimes it's even anglicized as pneumatics, but it means pneumatic in the spiritual sense, not in the sense of air or tires or anything of that sort. They also believed the demiurge had made the evil material world. And this is one area in which they diverged radically from proto-Catholic Christianity. You've certainly heard the various creeds, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed. And these were written with a very specific purpose. Each line was meant to refute or deny a specific heresy, as understood by the nascent Catholic Church. So, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. If you say that, you're denying the Gnostic position that the world is the creation of the demiurge. So if you said that in some kind of, formal, I swear upon everything I hold dear kind of way, it meant that you were not a Gnostic. You were repudiating Gnosticism. Well, as I say, the Gnostics perished. Their texts survived, sometimes in the writings of their enemies, who often give the most elaborate descriptions. Some Gnostic texts have been rediscovered, often fragmentarily. The largest cache of Gnostic scriptures is called the Nag Hamadi Library. These are a bunch of texts discovered by an Egyptian peasant digging for fertilizer in 1945. And they made their way around, and they were eventually published. And you can read them yourself. You can buy a copy of the Nag Hamadi Library. It's called a library, but it's a book about that thick. And it has some very, very interesting texts that illuminate many of these positions and elaborate on many of the things that I've just said. As a sideline, the reason these texts were preserved probably has to do with the fact that the Bishop of Alexandria in the 367 AD, whose name was Athanasius, sent out a letter There are all kinds of these scriptures around, these gospels according to Thomas and Bartholomew and who knows what. Most of them are spurious. These are the only texts that are proved to be read in churches or probably anywhere else. And those are 27 texts, and he lists them, and those are the texts of the New Testament as we have them. So probably this monastery in Egypt got this thing and said, oh my God, well, I guess we have, I guess we got to get rid of these things. I guess we're supposed to burn them, but I really just don't have the heart to do that. Let's just put them in these jars and bury them, which is the only reason that 1,600 years later they were found and rediscovered and so on. So, this is an enormous amount of information that I think, if you consider it seriously, casts some very important light not only on the Gnostics, but on the beliefs of the New Testament Christians. I really don't think you can understand Paul without having this notion of these archons, these principalities and powers that were wicked and were being overthrown. Some Gnostics claimed a lineage back to Paul. One of the most important Gnostics was Valentinus, who claimed he got it from one Theodus, otherwise unknown, who, he said, got this as a secret doctrine from Paul himself. Can this be proven? No, it cannot. But just from the very little we've seen, it's not hard to see how Paul's teaching could have easily evolved into Gnosticism. And Paul's writings were particularly prized by the Gnostics, who, by the way, actually were way back when said these are these are authentically Pauline letters. These are not. The ones who are not are 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, probably 2nd Thessalonians. And that is exactly what modern scholars have come to conclude for completely different reasons and from completely different grounds. So the Gnostics may have known something. In any case, this is an enormous amount of information. And at this point, you are very, very likely saying, what on earth is this all about? Why should we even possibly care about these forgotten things, this demiurge, this bizarre cosmic cosmology that has nothing to do with astronomy as we know it today? Well, there may be some reason to at least take some threads of the Gnostic argument and see what we can make of them. Here's what I'm suggesting. The demiurge is the world generator. Notice it was craftsman, creator. Now, this is not a God up in the sky who made this evil world. It's actually much more close to us than that. You have a structure in your mind. I coined that expression because I don't know any equivalent expression in contemporary psychology to do it. But there's a part of your mind that takes all of this experience in and digests it and creates a world. Your senses filter out any number of times more data than they let in. And this part of the mind, which seems to be unknown to psychology, organizes it, creates a world out of it. This is the world you see. And the archons could be seen as kind of subsidiary structures, ways that we frame the universe. One idea that may be relevant here is the categories of Immanuel Kant. Kant said that we see the world through these filters that he called categories. And causation, negation, identity. There are 12 of them. And yeah, you can't conceive of a world without these things. Could you conceive of a world without causation? Could you conceive of a world without negation? No science fiction writer has ever been able to do that, no matter how wild-minded, because these are so fundamental. And yet, the Gnostics seem to be saying, these structures are defective. They show us a world that is not there and hide a world from us that is, in many important ways, quite different. And who says this also? The great world traditions. Buddha, it's avidya. Hindu, it's Maya. But it's the same fundamental delusoriness. This thing like, you know, it's sometimes just called ignorance, but it's not just like not knowing your times table. It's like not really grasping what the world is like in any reality or totality. So we're seeing a world that is not there. And present-day cognitive science has some interesting things to say along these lines. There is a cognitive scientist named Donald Hoffman at the University of California, Irvine, who says that our cognitive structures evolved for one purpose only: to ensure our survival. These senses filter out everything else. So again, these are, shall we say, we're conditioned to see the world in this way because this is the way we can survive in this world. But there are many things we're leaving out, many things we're not seeing, many things we don't understand. And the Gnostics and the mystics would say, yeah, that's true, but this is true in a more profound way than even he says. And moreover, there is a way out. One current teaching that has some strong resemblances to Gnosticism is a text known as A Course in Miracles, which I've described in other lectures. I won't go into what it is. But it consists, among other things, of 365 lessons, daily lessons, that are meant to deconstruct this world constructor, which is called, in the Course's language, the ego. And here are a couple of the early lessons. I see nothing as it is now. I'm upset because I see a meaningless world. Let me just add one final point in favor of this. If we're going back here, these cognitive structures are defective. This world generator is defective. Well, it might cast some light on the question that everybody is asking all the time and is completely unable to find an answer to. Why is the world such a crazy place? Why is everybody behaving so crazily? Nobody knows the answer to this. I mean, the sociologists, the economists, yeah, they all have their reasons and they fit into it, but they still don't account for the fundamental craziness of human behavior in many respects, both in terms of war and those things, but also very often in day-to-day life. This does, and it also points a way out. So, I'm upset because I see a meaningless world. But another lesson from the Course. So there is a way of, shall we say, entering this world. Course in Miracles provides one structured approach. The great world traditions present others. Really, their value lies more in their goal than in their specific techniques, all of which may and do work under certain circumstances. Well, that is an even bigger topic, and I'm going to end here. I do want to bring attention to my book, A Theology of Love, which does describe the theology of A Course in Miracles. That is the second half of this book. The first half is a discussion of our defective cognitive structures in more detail than I just went into. And here is another book that I'd like to draw your attention to, The Secret History of Gnosticism. Forbidden Faith, The Secret History of Gnosticism. This is a history of Gnosticism from then to now, and it does take in those first few centuries. But Gnostic currents, influences, beliefs survived in different forms, often underground, often under heavy persecution, right down to this day. One figure whose contemporary figure whose views is very strongly connected with that of the Gnostics, as he himself said, was the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, who's become very famous as the author of the book that was the basis of Blade Runner, Minority Report, and many other things. He did write a couple of more theological science fiction novels, one of which is called Valis, for Vast Acting Living Intelligence. So this book of mine has both of these things, discusses all of these elements down to the present day. So if you are interested in either aspect of what I've been talking about, you may wish to check out, buy, read one or both of these books. And I've said enough for one day, so thank you very much.